The fire had been cold for 2 days when Ezra Colton pushed open the cabin door and found his wife frozen in their bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned. What he built in the months that followed would be called the stupidest waste of time any mountaineer had ever attempted, until the winter of 1842 proved that mud and stone could hold heat longer than any iron stove ever forged. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. Ezra Colton had been gone for 5 days, checking his trap lines in the high valleys east of his cabin when the cold snap hit the Tennessee mountains. It was late February 1841, and winter had been unpredictable that year, swinging between mild days and bitter cold without warning. He had left Ruth with plenty of firewood stacked against the cabin wall, enough to last a week if she kept the fire going steadily. The fireplace was standard mountain construction, built from river stone with lime mortar he had purchased from a traveling merchant the previous autumn. It drew well enough and provided adequate heat when fed constantly, which was the problem with every fireplace Ezra had ever known. They consumed wood at an alarming rate and went cold within hours if not tended. The trap lines had been productive. Ezra had collected 7 marten pelts and 3 foxes, good money for early spring sales. He had planned to return after 3 days, but a late-season snow had made the high trails impassable, forcing him to take a longer route through the lower valleys. The delay added 2 days to his journey. He thought about Ruth during those extra days, wondered if she was managing the fire properly, hoped she was staying warm. He had no sense of foreboding, no intuition that anything was wrong. He simply wanted to get home. When he arrived at the cabin on the afternoon of March 2nd, everything looked normal from the outside. Snow lay undisturbed on the roof. No smoke rose from the chimney, but that was not unusual during daytime when Ruth might let the fire die down to conserve wood. He called out as he approached, expecting her to appear at the door. She did not. He called again, louder, thinking perhaps she was working in the root cellar or had gone to fetch water from the creek. Still no response. Ezra pushed open the door and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. The interior of the cabin was as cold as the air outside. His breath formed clouds in front of his face. The fireplace held nothing but old ashes, clearly cold for days. Ruth was in their bed against the far wall, motionless under a pile of every blanket and fur they owned. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled back the coverings. Her face was gray, her body rigid. She had been dead for at least 2 days, possibly longer. He stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Eventually, his mind began cataloging facts with the cold precision of shock. The woodpile outside was untouched, meaning Ruth had not gone out to get more fuel. The kindling box near the fireplace was empty. The fire had gone out, probably on the 2nd night of the cold snap. Ruth had piled on blankets and waited for him to return, growing colder each hour until her body simply stopped functioning. Ezra buried Ruth on the hillside above the cabin on March 4th, 1841. The ground was frozen solid. It took him 6 hours to dig a grave deep enough, breaking through frost-hardened earth with a pickaxe and shovel. He wrapped her body in their best quilt and lowered her into the hole. He had no words prepared. He simply stood beside the grave for an hour as the sun dropped toward the western ridges, then filled it in and marked it with a cross made from split oak. He did not cry. The grief sat in his chest like a stone, too heavy to move, too solid to break apart into tears. He returned to the cabin and built a fire in the fireplace that had failed to save his wife. The irony was not lost on him. He fed it logs throughout the night, watching flames consume wood that should have kept Ruth alive. The fireplace worked exactly as designed. Fire produced heat. Heat radiated into the room. When the fire diminished, the heat diminished. When the fire died completely, the cabin grew cold within hours. There was nothing wrong with the construction. It simply did what all fireplaces did. It required constant fuel and constant attention. By dawn, Ezra had burned through a quarter of his remaining woodpile. He sat at the table and calculated. A fireplace of this design consumed roughly 8 logs per night to maintain adequate heat during cold weather. His property had sufficient timber, but cutting, splitting, and hauling that much wood required hours of daily labor during winter months when other survival tasks competed for time. A trapper who ran long lines could not tend a fire every few hours. A person alone in a cabin could not maintain fire through the night without waking repeatedly. The system only worked if someone was always present and attentive. Ruth had been careful with resources. She must have tried to stretch the firewood by letting the fire burn lower at night. On a normal winter night, that would have been adequate. But when the extreme cold arrived and stayed, the reduced fire could not keep the cabin warm. She had probably waited too long to build it back up, or perhaps the cold had made her lethargic, slowing her reactions. By the time she realized the danger, she may have lacked the strength to go outside for more wood. So she had piled on blankets and waited for Ezra to return, and the cold had taken her anyway. Ezra understood in that moment that conventional fireplaces were fundamentally inadequate for mountain isolation. They worked in towns where neighbors were close and help was available. They worked in lowland settlements where winters were milder. But in the high country where trappers lived alone for months and cold could kill in a single night, a fireplace that went dead within hours was not sufficient. Something better was needed. Something that could hold heat longer, require less constant attention, and provide warmth even after the fire burned down. Ezra spent the next 2 weeks in a fog of routine maintenance. He checked traps mechanically, processed pelts without attention to quality, and returned each evening to the cabin that felt like a tomb. He kept the fire burning, but took no satisfaction from its warmth. Neighbors from downstream settlements stopped by to offer condolences. Thomas Hendricks brought salt pork and asked if Ezra planned to stay on the claim. The question irritated him. Of course he would stay. Leaving would mean Ruth had died for nothing. In early April, Ezra traveled to the settlement at Cades Cove to purchase supplies. The trip took 2 days by horseback. He needed powder and lead for his rifle, coffee, flour, and salt. He also needed distance from the cabin and its memories. The settlement consisted of perhaps 20 families scattered across the valley floor, farming and running small herds. A general store operated from a log building near the main trail. Ezra completed his purchases and prepared to leave immediately, but rain began falling in heavy sheets, forcing him to seek shelter. He found refuge in the workshop of Isaiah Weatherby, an elderly man who had lived in the cove for 30 years. Isaiah was a potter by trade, producing bowls, jugs, and crocks that he sold to families throughout the mountain region. His workshop was attached to his cabin, a small structure filled with clay vessels in various stages of completion. A massive kiln built from stone and clay occupied one corner, radiating residual heat from a recent firing. Isaiah offered Ezra coffee and a seat near the kiln. They sat, in comfortable silence for several minutes, before the old man spoke. He had heard about Ruth's death from travelers passing through. He expressed sympathy without empty platitudes. Then he asked what Ezra planned to do. The question was different from Hendricks's version. Isaiah was not asking if Ezra would leave. He was asking how Ezra would continue. Ezra found himself talking about the fireplace, about heat retention and wood consumption, and the impossibility of maintaining adequate warmth through long winter nights. Isaiah listened without interruption. When Ezra finished, the potter stood and walked to a shelf where several clay vessels sat waiting for firing. He picked up a thick-walled jug and handed it to Ezra. The vessel was heavy, dense, still slightly cool despite the workshop's warmth. Isaiah explained that clay had unique properties. It absorbed heat slowly, but released it slowly as well. A properly formulated clay mixture could hold warmth for hours after the heat source was removed. His kiln, built with thick clay walls mixed with sand and straw, stayed warm for 2 full days after firing. The residual heat allowed him to dry vessels and warm his workshop without burning additional fuel. The principle was thermal mass. Dense materials absorbed heat energy and released it gradually over extended periods. Ezra returned to his cabin with ideas spiraling through his mind. Isaiah had given him a bucket of clay from the riverbank near the cove and explained the basics of mixing it with sand and organic material to create compounds with different properties. Pure clay cracked when it dried. Clay mixed with sand became stronger and more stable. Clay mixed with straw or horsehair gained flexibility and could withstand thermal expansion without fracturing. The ratios mattered. Too much sand made the mixture crumbly. Too much clay made it prone to cracking. Finding the right balance required experimentation. Ezra spent the next month testing mixtures. He collected clay from the riverbank below his cabin, digging down past the topsoil to reach the dense gray deposit beneath. He gathered sand from the creek bed. He pulled horsehair from his mount's tail and collected dried grass from the meadow near his property line. He mixed batches in different ratios, formed them into small blocks, and left them to dry in the sun. Some cracked immediately. Some crumbled when handled. A few remained solid and showed promise. Thomas Hendricks stopped by in early May and found Ezra kneeling beside rows of mud blocks arranged on flat stones near the cabin. Hendricks stood watching for several minutes before speaking. He asked what in God's name Ezra was doing. Ezra explained he was testing clay mixtures for thermal mass properties. Hendricks stared at him as if he had lost his mind. He said Ruth's death had affected Ezra more deeply than anyone realized. Playing in the mud like a child was not productive behavior for a grown man with trap lines to run. Ezra did not argue. He simply continued his work. Hendricks left shaking his head. Within a week, the story had spread through the scattered mountain community. Ezra Colton had gone strange after his wife froze. He was mixing mud and talking about heat retention like some kind of natural philosopher. Men who trapped for a living did not need fancy ideas. They needed firewood and common sense. The consensus was that grief had damaged Ezra's judgment, and he would eventually abandon his foolishness and return to normal work. But Ezra was not playing. He was testing the dried blocks by heating them near his fireplace and measuring how long they stayed warm. He discovered that blocks with higher clay content held heat longer but were more prone to cracking. Blocks with more sand were stable but released heat quickly. The addition of horsehair created internal structure that prevented cracking while maintaining thermal properties. After dozens of failed batches, he developed a mixture that showed genuine promise: 3 parts clay, 1 part sand, and enough horsehair to create visible fiber throughout the compound when mixed wet. He formed larger blocks using this formula: rectangular pieces roughly 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. He left them to dry for 2 weeks, then placed them directly in his fireplace and built a hot fire around them. The blocks held. Ezra watched them through the night as flames heated them to temperatures that would have shattered his earlier attempts. The horsehair burned away, leaving tiny channels throughout the clay matrix, but the structure remained intact. By morning, the fire had died to coals, yet the blocks radiated heat when he held his hand near them. He pulled them from the fireplace using iron tongs and set them on the dirt floor. They stayed warm for 6 hours, longer than any stone he had ever tested. He had found his formula. Now he needed to scale up production. Over the next month, Ezra collected clay by the bucket load, hauling it up from the riverbank in leather sacks. He gathered sand from multiple locations along the creek, testing each source to ensure consistency. He filled a barrel with horsehair pulled from his mount and from wild horses he encountered in the high meadows. The collection process was tedious, but he needed substantial quantities to build what he envisioned. His plan was ambitious. He would construct a fireplace that used his thermal mass blocks as the primary structural element, not just as supplementary heat storage. The blocks would form the core of the firebox, positioned where they would absorb maximum heat. River stones would surround them, bound together with mortar made from the same clay mixture. The entire structure would become a heat battery, absorbing energy from the fire and releasing it over extended periods. Jacob Merritt visited in late June and found Ezra forming blocks on a work table he had built outside the cabin. Dozens of finished blocks lay drying on racks improvised from saplings. More were stacked inside the cabin, already cured. Merritt asked direct questions. What were they for? How much time had Ezra invested? Did he intend to sell them? Ezra explained his thermal mass theory and his plan to rebuild his fireplace. Merritt listened thoughtfully, then asked why Ezra did not simply buy an iron stove from a merchant. Iron held heat reasonably well and was proven technology. Ezra had considered iron stoves. They were expensive, often costing more than a trapper earned in a full season. They were heavy, difficult to transport into remote mountain locations. They still required constant fuel, and iron, while better than stone, did not hold heat as long as dense clay. His blocks, once heated, stayed warm for hours. A fireplace built entirely from these blocks and stones would outperform any iron stove for a fraction of the cost. The only investment was time and labor. Merritt remained skeptical but admitted the logic was sound if the blocks performed as described. He suggested Ezra build a small test structure before committing to a full fireplace reconstruction. Ezra agreed. He spent the next week building a simple box from his blocks, mortared together with his clay mixture. He built a fire inside it, let it burn for 4 hours, then extinguished it. The box stayed warm enough to heat water placed on top of it for 12 hours afterward. The test convinced him to proceed. Ezra began demolition of his existing fireplace in mid-July 1841. The work was destructive and emotionally difficult. This was the fireplace that had failed Ruth, but it was also the structure they had built together when they first claimed the land 3 years earlier. He pried apart the river stones carefully, salvaging those that were undamaged. The old lime mortar crumbled easily. Within 2 days he had reduced the fireplace to a pile of loose stones and a smoke-stained section of log wall. He started construction with the foundation, something the original fireplace had lacked. He dug down 18 inches and filled the excavation with tightly packed stones, creating a stable base that would not settle or shift. Over this, he laid flat stones to form a level floor for the firebox. The floor extended outward from the wall, creating a hearth area where he could place tools and sit near the heat. The firebox construction was where his innovation became visible. He positioned his 2 largest thermal blocks horizontally, forming massive rectangular pieces that would sit directly above the fire chamber. Each block weighed approximately 40 pounds and measured 20 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. These pieces had taken a week each to form and cure. They represented the heart of his design, positioned where they would absorb maximum heat from the flames below. But first, he needed to build up to that level. He began laying river stones in courses, using his clay mixture as mortar. He selected stones carefully for size and shape, fitting them together to minimize gaps. The mortar was applied thickly, filling every space between stones. As it dried, it formed a bond stronger than the original lime mortar had ever achieved. The clay gripped the stones and hardened into a cohesive mass rather than just filling gaps. He built the side walls of the firebox first, creating a chamber 14 inches wide and 16 inches deep. The stones rose in stable courses, each layer drying before he added the next. The process was slow. Where a conventional fireplace could be built in 3 or 4 days, Ezra's construction stretched into weeks. Neighbors who passed by made comments. Thomas Hendricks stopped one afternoon and observed that Ezra had spent more time on this fireplace than most men spent building an entire cabin. He asked if Ezra intended to worship at this shrine to mud and stone. Ezra responded without anger. He said he was building something that would work properly. Hendricks laughed and rode on, but others were more curious than mocking. Daniel Kearns, a trapper from the eastern valleys, stopped for 2 days and watched Ezra work. He asked detailed questions about the clay mixture and the purpose of the large blocks. Ezra explained thermal mass principles as Isaiah had taught him. Kearns remained skeptical but admitted he would be interested to see if the theory proved practical. When the firebox walls reached the appropriate height, Ezra positioned his 2 massive thermal blocks across the opening. The blocks sat perfectly level, resting on the stone walls with their bottom surfaces flush against the mortar. Ezra had calculated the placement carefully. The blocks would absorb heat from flames rising directly beneath them, while also serving as structural lintels supporting the upper fireplace construction. He mortared them in place with extra care, ensuring complete contact between the blocks and supporting stones. The clay mixture filled every gap, creating thermal continuity throughout the structure. Above the blocks, he continued building with river stones, constructing the upper firebox and chimney throat. He shaped the interior carefully, creating a smooth transition from the wide firebox to the narrower chimney passage. The geometry encouraged efficient draft while maximizing the surface area exposed to rising heat. Every stone was mortared with his clay compound. the entire structure became a unified mass rather than individual components held together by adhesive. The chimney rose through the cabin roof, built from the same river stones and clay mortar. Ezra extended it 3 feet above the roofline to ensure proper draft and prevent downdrafts during storms. He capped it with flat stones arranged to shed rain while allowing smoke to escape. The final chimney structure was heavier and more substantial than standard construction, but it was also far more durable. The entire fireplace took 8 weeks to complete. It consumed all his thermal blocks and most of his clay mixture. The structure was massive, extending 4 feet from the cabin wall and rising 7 feet to the chimney transition. The 2 large rectangular blocks were visible above the firebox opening, their orange-brown surfaces contrasting with the gray and tan river stones surrounding them. To anyone familiar with standard fireplace construction, the design looked primitive and excessive. Thomas Hendricks, seeing it complete, said it resembled something a child would build if given too many rocks and buckets of mud. Ezra let the structure cure for 2 weeks before attempting to use it. The clay mortar needed time to dry and harden. During this period, he cooked outside over an open fire and slept cold at night. The weight tested his patience, but he understood that rushing would risk cracking the mortar before it achieved full strength. On September 8, 1841, Ezra built the inaugural fire. He used kindling and small splits of oak, building flames gradually to avoid thermal shock. The fire caught easily. The chimney drew perfectly, pulling smoke upward without hesitation. He fed larger logs into the firebox, building heat steadily. Within an hour, the flames were substantial, filling the firebox and licking around the thermal blocks above. He maintained the fire for 4 hours, adding logs to keep flames constant. The river stones grew warm to the touch. The thermal blocks absorbed heat silently, their surfaces radiating increasing warmth into the cabin. By evening, the entire structure was thoroughly heated. Ezra let the fire burn down to coals, then stopped adding fuel. He wanted to test heat retention without interference from active flames. The coals died completely around midnight. Ezra remained awake, checking the fireplace every hour. The stones stayed warm. The 2 massive thermal blocks radiated heat that he could feel from 3 feet away. By dawn, 14 hours after he had stopped adding fuel, the cabin remained comfortably warm. He placed his hand on the blocks. They were still hot enough that prolonged contact was uncomfortable. The river stones surrounding them retained substantial heat. The entire fireplace had become exactly what he had envisioned, a massive battery that absorbed energy during burning and released it slowly over extended time. He ran the test for 3 more days, building fires each evening and letting them die overnight. Each morning, the cabin was warm. The fireplace held heat for 16 to 18 hours, depending on how long he burned the initial fire. On the 4th day, he built a larger fire and maintained it for 6 hours. That night, even with outdoor temperatures dropping near freezing, the cabin stayed warm enough that he slept comfortably with a single blanket. The heat lasted into the following afternoon, more than 20 hours after the last flame died. Word spread through the mountain community with surprising speed. Daniel Kearns returned in October and spent an evening in the cabin, experiencing the heat retention firsthand. He touched the thermal blocks 12 hours after the fire had gone out and found them still radiating warmth. He asked permission to tell others about what Ezra had built. Ezra agreed. He had no interest in keeping the technique secret. If it could help others survive mountain winters, they were welcome to the knowledge. The real test came in January 1842. A cold front swept down from the north, bringing temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks. This was the kind of cold that killed livestock, froze water in buckets within minutes, and made every breath painful. It was worse than the cold that had taken Ruth. Ezra burned a fire each evening from dusk until he went to sleep around midnight. Each morning, the cabin was warm enough that frost did not form on the interior walls. He used approximately 1/3 the firewood that conventional fireplaces consumed during similar cold. Thomas Hendricks was not faring as well. His cabin was a mile downstream, and during the second week of the cold snap, he appeared at Ezra's door near noon. His face was gray with cold exhaustion. He said his fireplace was consuming wood faster than he could cut it. He was burning constantly, waking every 2 hours through the night to add logs, and still the cabin grew dangerously cold between feedings. His wife was sick, weakened by the relentless cold. He asked if what people said about Ezra's fireplace was true. Ezra invited him inside. The cabin was comfortably warm despite no fire burning since the previous midnight. Hendricks stood near the fireplace and held his hands toward the thermal blocks. Heat radiated against his palms. Hendricks asked how it was possible. Ezra explained the thermal mass principle, showed him the clay mixture formula, and described the construction process. Hendricks listened carefully, his earlier mockery completely absent. He asked if Ezra would help him rebuild his fireplace using this method. His wife needed reliable warmth, and he could not continue burning wood at the current rate. Within a month, he would deplete his entire supply and face the remainder of winter with no fuel reserves. Ezra agreed to help. The work would need to wait until the cold snap passed, as clay mortar could not cure properly in freezing temperatures. But he could teach Hendricks how to prepare materials immediately. Over the next week, whenever weather permitted, Hendricks came to Ezra's cabin to learn. Ezra showed him how to collect and test clay from the riverbank, how to mix it with sand and horsehair in proper ratios, how to form thermal blocks and cure them slowly to prevent cracking. Hendricks was a capable learner. He grasped the principles quickly and began producing blocks that matched Ezra's quality. By early February, when temperatures moderated slightly, Hendricks had 20 blocks, ready and sufficient clay mixture prepared for mortar. Ezra helped him demolish his old fireplace and begin construction of the new one. The process took 3 weeks. They worked carefully, allowing each section to cure before proceeding. Ezra supervised the placement of thermal blocks and the shaping of the firebox geometry. When completed, Hendricks's fireplace was smaller than Ezra's, but followed the same design principles. 2 thermal blocks positioned above the firebox, river stones mortared with clay compound, proper draft configuration, and substantial mass throughout. Hendricks built the first fire in late February. The results matched Ezra's experience. Heat retention extended through the night and into the following day. His wife recovered her strength in a cabin that stayed consistently warm. Hendricks stopped mocking Ezra's methods and started telling everyone he encountered about the mud mixture that saved his household. Jacob Merritt built one in March. Daniel Kearns constructed his in April before leaving for summer trap lines. By the spring of 1842, 7 families in the mountain region had rebuilt their fireplaces using Ezra's technique. None called it stupid anymore. They called it the Colton method, or thermal block construction, or simply the smart way to build. Men who had previously dismissed Ezra as grief-addled now sought his advice. He shared his knowledge freely, helping anyone who asked, teaching the mixture ratios and construction principles without expecting payment. The innovation spread beyond the immediate region. Travelers passing through the settlements saw the unusual fireplaces and asked about them. Families moving into the mountains heard stories about fireplaces that stayed warm for days. By 1843, variations of Ezra's design were appearing in cabins throughout the Appalachian highlands. Not everyone adopted the method. Some still preferred conventional construction or iron stoves. But those who faced harsh winters in isolated locations recognized the value of a fireplace that required less constant attention and consumed less fuel while providing superior warmth. Ezra Colton never sought recognition for what he had built. He continued trapping through the 1840s, running his lines each season and returning to the cabin that stayed warm through the coldest nights. He remarried in 1844, a widow named Catherine, who had lost her husband to a logging accident. She moved into the cabin and immediately appreciated the fireplace that required one evening fire instead of constant feeding. They had 2 children, born in 1845 and 1847, who grew up in warmth that most mountain children never experienced. The fireplace required minimal maintenance over the years. Ezra repointed some mortar joints in 1846 where minor cracking had appeared, but the thermal blocks remained solid. By 1850, it had survived 9 winters without significant deterioration. The clay compound had hardened through repeated heating cycles into something approaching ceramic strength. The river stones remained locked in place, held by mortar that had become nearly as strong as the stones themselves. The fireplace's efficiency meant Ezra spent less time cutting firewood and more time on productive work. His traplines expanded, his income increased. He purchased additional land and raised cattle in the meadows near his property. The financial advantages of burning one-third the fuel of conventional fireplaces compounded over years into substantial savings. What neighbors had mocked as wasted time during construction paid dividends every winter for decades. The technique continued spreading throughout the Appalachian region. By 1855, thermal block fireplaces were common enough that newcomers to the mountains often built them as first choice rather than conventional designs. The specific construction details varied. Some builders used different clay sources or modified the block dimensions, but the core principle remained consistent. Dense clay blocks positioned for maximum heat absorption, surrounded by stone mass, all bonded with clay mortar that contributed to thermal retention. Ezra's children learned the technique from watching their father. His son built his own cabin in 1863 using thermal block construction. His daughter married a man from a downstream settlement and taught him how to mix the clay compound properly. The knowledge passed through families and communities, becoming standard wisdom rather than innovation. Within a generation, people built thermal mass fireplaces without knowing who had developed the method. Ezra died in 1871 at age 61 from pneumonia complications. Catherine lived in the cabin for another 12 years before moving to live with their daughter. The property changed hands twice before 1890, but the fireplace remained functional. The thermal blocks that Ezra had formed in 1841 continued radiating heat from fires built by people who never knew his name. Modern historians estimate the thermal block technique saved dozens of lives across the Appalachian highlands during the mid-19th century. Families survived harsh winters that would have killed them in cabins with conventional fireplaces. Children grew up healthier in consistently warm environments rather than structures that swung between overheated and dangerously cold. The innovation emerged from tragedy. Ruth Colton's death drove Ezra to solve a problem most mountain men accepted as unavoidable. His solution required no advanced technology or expensive materials, just local clay, river stones, and understanding of thermal mass principles. The ridicule he faced was forgotten once winter proved his methods superior. Some original thermal block fireplaces still exist in preserved cabins throughout the Appalachian region. The blocks remain intact, hardened by more than a century of heating cycles. They are not celebrated as engineering marvels. They simply exist as functional remnants of a time when survival required creative solutions. The mud mixture that neighbors mocked became the standard for building fireplaces that burned hot for days, saving fuel, saving labor, and saving lives across mountains, where cold could kill as surely as any predator. Ezra Colton's legacy was not fame, but warmth that persisted long after his name was forgotten, built into structures that still stand as proof that sometimes the stupidest ideas are simply the ones nobody else had thought to try.